Hi, it's your Pocket Skeptimist here, and I want to make a few preliminary comments on the latest batch of videos released by Steve Huff, or Huff Paranormal, because ever since I watched his video entitled Spirits Say They Want to Dissect My What? Oh my, hear it, back on June the 20th, in which he and his wife attempt some so-called instrumental transcommunication, or ITC, inside a mausoleum, using the free Android Banshee application running through a USB speaker device, and he heard a whistle over the transmission, which he and his wife created a huge fuss about in the video. I reproduced his experiment using the same technology, and in doing so, got exactly the same whistle, note for note. Now, there are two possible interpretations of this result. Either Steve and I both got in touch with the exact same spirit who was able to produce the exact same tone, which, by the way, has an identical waveform, for me, as it did for him, during a live session, or the whistle was emanating from the same audio source, i.e. the application's pre-recorded sound bank, rather than any so-called spirits who may have been trying to manipulate the signal. Under the principle of parsimony, which states that the simpler, more elegant explanation is statistically far more likely to be the correct one, given that less unlikely events have to converge in order to produce the data, I'd speculate the latter case is probably the correct one. Now, Steve Huff has never claimed the applications do any more than scan through IP signals for radio channels, and cut those signals in with pre-recorded banks of sounds, and subsequently output them via the signal output of the device. But he's been recently claiming that he's been hearing responses that aren't accounted for by those two available sources of noise. He records them and uploads his conversations, I say in inverted commas, to YouTube, often with seemingly compelling results. And I should qualify that by saying I'm saying he achieves seemingly compelling results if you believe that his demonstrations in his most recently claimed two-way conversations between the living and the dead include accurate transcription of the so-called spirit or ghost voices in his subtitles. In fact, as expected, I've listened to a multitude of his videos without first watching his rather large and suggestive subtitles, and almost without fail, I've never picked out the same phrases he's tended to transcribe them as. Then when I go to check the subtitles he's come up with in the same video, again, with almost 100% assurance, I'm quite surprised and often amused to discover how little his interpretation aligns with mine. And I urge you all to try this. Simply get a pen and paper, watch one of his videos without looking at the screen, write down what you think the ghost voice is saying, and then go and check back with his video subtitles to see how accurate your interpretation was in terms of aligning with his. And, maybe stick a comment down below and tell me how you got on. But it seems to me there's no example of conversation contained within his videos which can't be accounted for by a tag team of pareidolia, which is a psychological bias or phenomenon whereby a subject's mind or brain responds to a stimulus, i.e. a sound or sight, and then interprets that stimulus as a pattern where there is none. The interpreted pattern is usually largely informed by the subject's prior beliefs or conviction, and autosuggestion caused by him front-loading his audience with very bold subtitles, which obviously sways their first hearing of the stimulus, which in this case is the ghost voices. And if he is doing this, it's noteworthy to mention at this point that he might still not be willfully being deceptive. I mean, plenty of people simply share their mistaken beliefs or mistaken interpretations of stimuli all the time, often forthrightly. For example, somebody might say they saw a gigantic face in the clouds after 9/11. It may well have looked like that if you front-load the next person with that information, and then they may then spread that misperception to their friends, and so on and so on and so on, and so the urban myth propagates. But as Steve urges us to do on several occasions, let's give him the benefit of the doubt for a moment, because as he himself suggests, to come to this with a negative mindset might simply bias our judgment towards cynicism, and we won't be able to enjoy the rich spiritual experience he's trying to clue us in on. However, in the case of the whistle that I was talking about previously, his seeming predisposition to immediately assume that every sound is a spirit voice, rather than the more likely explanation that it's produced by one of the live or pre-recorded audio sources he's running, struck me as a cause for concern. So I've decided to delve a little deeper to try and get a handle on what's going on in his videos, and I've come up with some interesting findings. What I've been doing recently is using a graphic frequency spectrum analyzer and a spectrograph, which are two tools that allow the user to visually represent audio files in order to closely analyze their audio. And I've been running the audio from Steve Huff's most recent batch of videos through it in order to try and get a clearer handle on what's going on. Now, I should preface this by stating that I'm in no way, nor by anyone's standards, an audio expert. I have a hobbyist's interest in audio analysis and would therefore welcome comments, suggestions, or outright criticism from anybody who does possess expertise in this field in order to get to the bottom of what could be going on in Huff's audio. However, I do feel that my comments provide interesting contributions to the conversation, at least in terms of giving a few questions that Huff will need to answer in order to convince anyone with a critical mindset that his claims are true. And we should bear in mind that we need to take his reluctance to want to convince critical analysts as highly dubious, since as an investigator of paranormal claims, he should want his research to survive the highest investigative standards. So I offer this analysis in that spirit, and if anyone wishes to criticise the analysis and accompanying argument that I make, please do. I would love Steve's claims to be true. Now I'm going to show you the first spectrograph that I output, which is produced from the first video where he makes the strong claim that he's developed his Wonderbox Gold, which as far as I can tell is essentially a hacked miniature guitar amplifier with some effects pedals Velcro taped to the side, to the point where there's no longer any division between the spirit world and the living world. And according to this specific video, which he imaginatively entitled, "I Can Now Connect Direct with the Dead, This Session Changed My Life," he can now, thanks to his tireless work tinkering with his Frankenstein's monster of guitar equipment, copper wire which he's wound to the top in order to more tightly attune to the spirit frequencies, and IP phone applications, provide direct two-way communication with the dead. Now, I want to make an aside here about two features of this video, which might be worth bearing in mind. First, this is actually the first video I've ever noticed Steve including cheesy, dramatic, choral-type music in the background of his videos, and that's not to say he hasn't before, it's just the first time that I've ever noticed it present in his productions. But he's also, secondly, started wearing a black turtleneck sweater with a substantial silver crucifix hung around his neck. And now, up until that point of releasing that video, Steve had always claimed to be a fairly secular investigator, at least in terms of not affiliating with any religious orthodoxy, and who was previously skeptical of paranormal claims and sought to debunk them initially, but in doing so actually found that he had some data that needed some serious further investigation, or so his story goes. But it's worth noting that at the very least these two stylistic choices that he's clearly made, I mean nobody's forcing him to make them, aren't necessarily indicative of that kind of character, particularly in the light of the way his audience seems to have grown since his earlier videos, which has inevitably, and unsurprisingly given the strength of his new claims, seen a huge boom in the spiritualist demographic, as he has seemingly provided more and more validation for their beliefs. Perhaps his new style is merely an attempt to pander to them. However, one other viable interpretation is that as his audience has grown and time has progressed, he's done more research on the styles of presentation which seem to work well in that field, and certainly, with his new garb and dramatic musical theatrics, would fit in very well at a spiritualist pastor's convention. However, let's give him the benefit of the doubt again on this, and after all, he could just be using the Wonderbox to channel Steve Jobs. Ooh. Indefensible wisecracks about the dearly departed aside, let's get a look at these spectrograph images then. So this is the first image, as I said before, from the aforementioned video. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about what we're seeing here in the image. So first of all, this sort of black navy blue portion up here is dead noise. It's basically the portion of the graph which represents all of the noise that's not being touched into by the device. Secondly, we've got this sort of this background of greeny yellow sort of peppered up there with red spots. That represents the ambient room noise during speech or during the dialogue portion. This sort of midway section here, which seems to look a little bit like a canyon if it was a cross-section of a canyon, and that's almost what it is in terms of audio spectrography, is just where no vocal is happening. It's just ambient room noise or ambient noise. So this structure here on at the leftmost side of the spectrograph contains this sort of yellowy ambient room noise, and this very, very pink to white peak running up through it is a vocal frequency, and in this particular case, it's one that represents Steve Huff speaking. Conversely, on the right-hand side here, we have a much greener ambient room noise, and we have a big fat pink peak here, and another one that's running straight up through that ambient room noise, which represents the ghost speak. And what we see here across the two halves of this audio is a very, very definite line down between them. So the ambient room noise has actually shifted in frequency quite dramatically between the ghost type speak and Steve Huff speaking. So we get a very, very different kind of background ambient noise. We also get very different levels in frequency, which is to be expected given the kind of reverb and deep frequency of the ghost voices in comparison with Steve Huff's voice. We also have to account for the fact that it's coming out of a third-party audio device, namely a Wonderbox, and both speakers are running into his video and audio capture device. Let's contrast both of those clips then with those on the right. So you have a Steve Huff audio spike here, which is more or less consistent with the one on the left. And then you have one at the very rightmost, which represents another portion of ghost speak, which is very inconsistent with the one over on the left. So what you see here is a lot of breakup in the ambient white noise, which is consistent with a little bit of signal interruption or signal cancellation. You get very, very juttery vocal peaks, although the general level of the ambient white noise is roughly the same. You get a similar kind of coloration, and neither of them have ambient noise which is too far removed from what you're getting in the general static of the ambient room or the ambient dead noise. Now, I wanted to run my own test recording of a similar rig to the one Steve purports to be using in his videos through the spectrograph in order to see if I could achieve similar results to the ones we've observed in his readings, basically in order to provide some tentative confirmation or disconfirmation as to whether he really is using what he says he's using, and to see if we could rule out any audio clip editing on his part. This is my first spectrograph reading under the following conditions. I ran my Banshee app on my Samsung Galaxy S7 through the Bluetooth speaker into the room where I was asking it questions and recording both of us via a third-party dictaphone, which was an Olympus D450. And here's what we see on the spectrograph. So we can see here right off the bat on the leftmost portion of the spectrograph, this is my vocal peak, basically, in this section that I've segmented off here. Then we have a so-called response from the Bluetooth speaker, which has a much shorter pink peak running through the ambient white noise, which is, it's fairly obvious why that would be. I had the dictaphone recording device much closer to me than I had to my device to try and stop it from clipping. This portion here is interesting, which is me and the so-called spirit, or else the audio bank running through the mobile device and the Bluetooth speaker, talking at the same time. So we kind of cut across each other and cancelled out a little bit of the white noise. But you can definitely see that both structures are running at the same time against the background noise. The really interesting thing about this graph is that between the portions where I am speaking and the portions where the Bluetooth speaker is speaking alone, you see absolutely no deviations in the background noise of the graph at all, and you see no deviations in the coloration of the dead noise up at the top. This, to me, sort of opens up a number of possibilities. First of all, we can't rule out the possibility that Steve Huff may be editing his own audio. So he may be grabbing these portions of the spectrograph in some kind of DAW or audio editing software, clipping them, and then taking those clips and enhancing them in various ways, increasing the volume, adding more reverb, or adding compression so that it brings the audio levels up to speed with his own voice hitting his third-party audio capture device. There's a number of things that he could be doing to enhance it. So I ran a couple more tests and ran a couple more spectrographs in order to try and either provide some confirmation or rule out that that's what he could be doing. So I've got a spectrograph here where I took my own audio results and I did what I just said. I clipped some of the, or split some of the audio, and I enhanced the spirit voice. And what you get here is much more characteristic of a clip edit. So this is the spirit portion of the speech. This is me speaking. And you see a very definite change in the structure, as we did with Steve's section, although it's a much more pronounced result than Steve gets. I mean, you get a very, very definite change in the dead noise up at the top. You get a huge dramatic change in the coloration of the ambient background noise, and the peak itself becomes almost red as the sort of gain goes off the charts, really. But you still get the same level of limit, which is the kind of result that you would see in Steve's original data. So this test was supposed to investigate whether I could achieve a Steve type of spectrograph by merely enhancing my own audio clips. And I wouldn't be able to rule that out as impossible from the comparison between our spectrographs. We do see a lot of the same structural features in the background and dead noise portions of the graph, which is normally very telling in spectrography. However, my result is far more pronounced, indicating that something far more subtle is going on in Steve's case. So I wasn't overly satisfied that my result was duplicating Steve's process and suspected I could achieve closer results with other methods. So my speculative verdict on this method for the moment is that Steve could be doing something similar, but given how much more dramatically my editing method affects all regions of the graph, especially given that I didn't dramatically edit my own audio in a way which scales with the shocking disparity between the two graphs, I would suggest exploring other options first. Now, this next spectrograph is an audio test I did in which I recorded two different audio tracks. One where I asked the questions, and another in which I recorded some responses. I then imported both files into my audio editing software, cut them together nicely, and enhanced the latter so they sounded more spiritual, I suppose. That is, I added some compression, reverb, EQ, and gain. I then compressed them into the same audio file and imported that output file into the spectrograph. And this test was supposed to test to see whether I could create a spectrograph more like Steve's by overdubbing clips into the baseline audio. Hello, if anyone's here, I invite them to speak now. I'm gonna shit all over your face. Is anyone there? If they are, use this device to communicate. You look like a fucking asshole. Immediately, when we look at the spectrograph, we can see something that's far more consistent with the original Steve-type spectrograph. So, again, we've got on the left-hand side, me speaking, followed by my clip edit, or overdub, of me providing a ghostly response. And then, again, we've got another one of my sort of normal paranormal investigator type voice portions over here in the rightmost portion, and then it goes on to sort of have another couple of responses that you can't see on this portion of the graph. Immediately you get much more consistency in the dead noise portion between the two clips, but you can see some change. Basically, that's a result of mixing. I made sure that I mixed the audio so that it was fairly level and made sure that there weren't too many jumps. You can see it sort of goes out of whack here, where you get a very definite structural feature in the graph over on the right-hand side. But this portion here is quite well edited in terms of actually, keeping in level and keeping the compression levels consistent and keeping... even with effects applied and things of that nature, you still get a fair consistency in the top levels here. You do see a bit of a structural feature when the cut comes in, which you kind of see a more pronounced version of that in Steve's spectrograph. What I would say about that is that perhaps Steve, if I may say so, is employing a little bit more of a, if he is employing this method at all, employing a little more of a crude editing method than I am employing, either to in order to grossly enhance the level of audio clip that he's importing to overdub his baseline audio with, or else simply just because he doesn't necessarily have that much expertise in audio editing, or at the very least he wasn't that proficient at audio editing at the time of making that video. In fact, I'm going to pull up one other spectrograph, which is actually from a more recent video than the one that I showed you at the very start of this presentation. And it seems to be far more consistent with this type of test that I conducted. You can see it's almost across the board an identical kind of format to the first example. So he's clearly using the same method of audio editing. He's just gotten much better at it because the result is far more subtle. You do still see some structural inconsistencies between the ghost voice and the human speech, but there is a more subtle blend between the two. And in fact, in this middle portion here, it's almost a seamless gradient from the ghost speech into the human speech, although you can see on the left and the right hand side two more definite kind of structures here, which does suggest that my clip edit testing is much more consistent with whatever method Steve Huff is currently using and seemingly getting more proficient at in his audio production as time goes on. So that's all the spectrograph data that I have. If anybody wants to contribute to that data, criticize my data, or add any comments or suggestions to the conversation on this spectrography of Steve Huff's paranormal claims, then I welcome that. My data at the moment seems to suggest that the closest method that I can use to approximate Steve's spectrograph is some kind of clip editing or overdubbing method where I overdub responses from so-called spirit audio onto a baseline audio track, mix them down, output them, and then run them through the spectrograph. That's not to say that that's the method Steve is using for definite, but it does seem to provide at least a question that Steve has to answer in order to convince somebody who's critically evaluating his audio files. And there are a couple more closing remarks that I'd like to make about Steve Huff in general in light of the data. So I just want to paint a general picture in terms of some wider comments on Steve's employed methodology for us to sort of fill in the details with this data that we've collected, by spelling out his employed methodology for capturing so-called electromagnetic voice phenomena, or EVP, a little more clearly. So he uses a method which has been named ITC by practitioners, which stands for Instrumental Transcommunication, which I'll explain a little more in detail later. But let me just first distinguish this from more classical or traditional EVP. So traditionally, practitioners of EVP would set up an audio capture device or two in an empty room and simply ask questions to the ambient noise. They would then take their audio device home, import the files into some audio analysis or editing software, and perhaps after some of their audio enhancements would be very surprised and amazed to find these incredibly distinct but previously inaudible audio artifacts on the recording, some of which sounded very much to them like voices amidst the white noise or ambient noise present in the live recording. So practitioners with a previously held spiritualist belief, or else just a generalist interest in those sort of ghost-like paranormal phenomena that we're all interested in, would often attribute these voice-like artifacts, some of which they interpreted as direct, intelligent responses to their questions, to spirits of the deceased. Now, notice that one feature of this kind of interpretation of the EVP data yielded by their recording method is that it's largely unfalsifiable. And that is to say that it's impossible in principle to logically or empirically disprove the claim that the artifacts on the recordings are dead people, because no matter what criticism or opposing evidence their claims face, practitioners could always add in some metaphysical caveat that places their claim outside of the scope of normal inquiry. So let's imagine this example. Elliot believes that there is a 50-mile wide extraterrestrial UFO floating above his house at all times. And when his friend Jim asks Elliot why nobody else can see the craft, Elliot just replies, well, the aliens have invisibility technology, so you can't see the UFO. And when a puzzled Jim then worries that, well, surely birds or low-flying terrestrial aircraft would run into even an invisible UFO, Elliot can then reply, well, that's true, but the ETs outside my house are so technologically advanced that their craft can physically phase shift in and out of space-time to avoid being hit by Earth objects. So Elliot could then ask us to bear in mind that this explanation accounts for why the UFOs can't be tracked by radar or other location identifying methods. However, notice that none of Elliot's explanations provide any positive evidence to Jim for the claim. They merely invite Jim to further suspend his disbelief in the presence of an extraordinary claim about the nature of the universe. But one has to wonder what, if anything, Elliot's theory or a hypothesis actually helps to explain. If he has a theory which helps us to make predictions or retrodictions about testable phenomena, or if this theory helps us to further explain aspects of our pre-existing theories in an elegant way, we might have some justification to take Elliot's ideas or theories seriously, and then conduct some further investigation. However, if Elliot's theory only helps us to explain some of Elliot's own outlandish beliefs, then we have to think very carefully about two questions. First, what reasons do we actually have to agree with him? And what reasons has he supplied us to agree with him? And the second question is, what does his UFO theory help us to explain which can't more plausibly or reasonably be explained by other more grounded terrestrial theories? Now, let's just take a moment to consider what Elliot is actually asking Jim to believe by extension if Jim is really to accept Elliot's claim as true. First, he's asking him to believe a claim currently unknown to modern science, that is, unknown to our absolute best critical standards of investigation, i.e. that there's not just life elsewhere in the universe, but intelligent life. Not only that, but he's asking us to believe that this civilization are so technologically advanced so as to be able to avoid all of the known physical problems associated with the faster-than-light travel. It'd certainly be required at the very least in order to get here before they all died, unless of course they lived for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Alternatively, they may have discovered a means to warp space and time in their favour, which would doubtless require huge amounts of energy to pull off. Next, he's asking Jim, or us, to not only believe all of that, but he's requiring him to believe that they not only chose our planet, which is one of hundreds of billions in our galaxy alone, out of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe, to visit, but they've chosen his own friend's house to pay a visit to. By now, you're probably getting the idea that that's a big, cumbersome theory to commit to or to get off the ground, and a far more gnarly, ugly, and inelegant theory than the theories that either Elliot is deceived, mistaken, or in some other way psychologically compromised. In the case of the traditional EVP, we have some very good working, reasonable explanations for the audio artifacts, which include the fact that most modern audio devices carry their own onboard gain boosters, audio compression, and low-cut filters, which, when stimulated under certain ambient conditions, raise and lower audio settings automatically to try and normalize noise and cancel noise. One common effect of these processes results in what we call compression artifacts, and these can sound pretty similar to guttural human throat-clearing noises, and can be fairly alarming when you first encounter them, especially on a dark night when you're only wearing headphones and you've got the gain boosted to about, 100 decibels or whatever. So in my view, this theory can be used to interpret, explain, and fully account for at least 90% of so-called traditional EVP noise artifacts. And even more of the phenomena, in my opinion, can be accounted for by human psychological biases such as pareidolia. However, more modern incarnations of EVP have cropped up over the past decade or so, and one of these is the method that Steve Huff is currently using, which is called ITC, and it's much more difficult to deal with. The method is roughly this. The practitioner wires some radio scanning device, whether that's an actual analog radio scanner or a digital IP equivalent phone application, up to a third-party speaker. In the more modern applications, these devices also include some kind of pre-recorded noise bank which cuts in from time to time during the scan. The audio is then output via the additional speaker, and the practitioner starts asking questions. The onus is then on the practitioner or the audience to interpret whether the randomly spouted noises from the app or third-party speaker combo are either radio signals, pre-recorded soundbank files, or spirits coming through. One much newer claim that Steve Huff favours, along with other ITC practitioners, is also that spirits are able to manipulate any of the digital or radio audio in order to construct speech, which accounts for why some of the sentences that they espouse seem to be in broken speech patterns, or else why they may otherwise seemingly be having difficulty in making sense in terms of direct, intelligent responses to the practitioner's questions. This could also account for a very worthwhile argument originally proposed, to my knowledge, by YouTuber Duck of Truth, who's a really stringent critical thinker, and he's done a lot of great work in posing questions that these ITC practitioners need to have adequate replies to in order to convince critical minds that their claims are true. I'll link him in either the video or the description, because anyone interested in this topic should really let his arguments sink in and just let them sort of hit them full in the face. So roughly speaking, he argues that in order for a spirit in another dimension to manipulate audio into FM or AM radio signals, they'd need to be able to verbalise in a sine wave at a consistent frequency, but be able to change the pitch whilst maintaining that frequency perfectly. A rather inhuman, extraordinary kind of physical feat, if you ask me. But if, as Steve claims, they're just manipulating pre-existing digital audio in order to construct a sentence, think of some kind of digital Ouija board, this concern might be accounted for in terms of Steve Huff's particular ITC methodology. Now, I'm not trying to claim that ITC practitioners in this video are fraudulent in a strong sense, nor am I trying to advocate the method, but just notice one thing, that the telling feature in the ITC method, which is that it allows practitioners to further avoid providing any kind of positive evidence for their claims. They're basically Elliot from our UFO example, but a lot further down the line. That is, they lay an additional layer of complexity to the kind of caveats that place traditional EVP practitioners outside of the scope of inquiry and just further muddy any kind of investigation into their data. And that should ring massive alarm bells, as it does for me and it does for Duck of Truth, or any other kind of critical mind aiming to sort of deal with this phenomenon that they're espousing. So just notice that their method is set up in such a way that they're able to constantly shift the goalposts in favour of any kind of empirical or skeptical or rational approach to their data. I mean, I've just done it for them in a way, and I've given a kind of reply that's not positive evidence to Duck of Truth, even though I don't necessarily agree with the reply that I've just constructed. But notice that I'm able to do this. I can shift the goalposts away from Duck of Truth scrutiny, which is very valid and worthwhile. But because I'm set up in such a way that I can just avoid it, I don't have to deal with it head on. I could just say, well, you know what? Actually, the spirits are just concocting all of these sentences from a bunch of pre-existing digital recordings. And then that's that AM/FM empirical argument dealt with. Or, you know, at the very least, it renders it that you don't have to deal with it. This, in my view, is one interpretation of Steve Huff's reason for including his own Wonderbox or GHOSTBOX style device. That is, that it allows him to build in all of these kind of claims about the audio conditions present at the time of recording in order to dodge careful scrutiny. Now again, I'm not claiming that Steve Huff nor any other ITC practitioner is definitely fraudulent, because I'm not sure where I stand legally on doing that, but I am going to heavily imply it. I am claiming that if they're... I'm joking there, that's obviously a joke. But the claim that I am making, and this is the important part that I really want to communicate here, the claim that I am making is that if their goal is to convince critical thinking people who are skeptical but open-minded about their work that their claims are true, then they're at least going to have to clear the first hurdle of these kinds of concern raised by either myself, by people like Duck of Truth, or there's some other great researchers out here who are just being disregarded in this field as cynics and people who don't want to, just trying to spoil the party. After all, if their claims are true, then they should be able to survive the harshest scrutiny and walk away unscathed. Just think about that. Any genuine researcher, as Steve Huff claims to be, should want their work to be subject to this kind of review. And in my view, if they are reluctant to do so, it's very difficult to see what their claims or explanations actually help us to understand about the nature of the universe or reality, besides that they've come up with a very intricate, unfalsifiable way to validate their own pre-existing worldview at best, and at worst, that they're very happy to spoon-feed an audience which is in some cases vulnerable with unsubstantiated work, and that, in my view, would be irresponsible. And I'm sure that anyone as compassionate and diligent as Steve often claims to be in his own videos would never be willfully irresponsible. Thanks.